How does a custodian who spends his days mopping floors and emptying trash cans end up standing before hundreds of people playing piano like a seasoned professional? And why are so many in the audience wiping away tears? The scene is almost surreal. The community center's main hall, usually reserved for senior yoga classes and neighborhood meetings, has been transformed. Every seat is filled. People are standing along the walls. And at the center of it all, sitting at an old upright piano, is Tyrone Washington, a man whose rough, calloused hands have spent more time gripping a mop than touching ivory keys. But tonight, those same hands are creating magic. The melody he plays is rich and soulful, a jazz standard from decades past. His eyes are closed, and there's a peace on his face that seems almost out of place for someone who's lived such a hard life. In the front row, his wife Angela holds their daughter's hand, both of them crying openly. Behind them, an elderly man with a trumpet stands ready to join, in his own eyes glistening with emotion. This isn't just a concert. This is something deeper, something that connects past and present sacrifice and redemption, loss and discovery. To understand how Tyrone Washington ended up here playing his grandmother's piano in front of his entire community, we need to go back. Back 3 months to an ordinary Tuesday morning when everything changed. Tyrone Washington had been working at the Milwaukee Community Center for 7 years. Every morning at 5:30, he'd arrive before anyone else, unlock the doors, and begin his routine. Mop the floors, clean the bathrooms, wipe down the windows, set up the chairs for whatever meeting or class was scheduled that day. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. It paid enough to keep his family afloat. Barely. His wife Angela worked double shifts at a diner across town, and between them they managed to cover rent, groceries, and the occasional treat for their 2 kids, 7-year-old Maya and 9-year-old Jaden. Tyrone never complained. He'd learned early in life that complaining changed nothing. You put your head down, did the work, and found your moments of peace wherever you could. For Tyrone, those moments came in the quiet of the early morning before the center filled with people. Sometimes he'd stand at the big windows in the main hall and watch the sunrise. Other times he'd sit in the break room and read a few pages of whatever library book he was working through. But on this particular Tuesday in late September, his routine was interrupted. "Tyrone, can you give me a hand with something?" It was Margaret, the center's director, a kind woman in her 60s who'd given Tyrone his job and never treated him like he was less than anyone else. "Sure thing, Miss Margaret. What do you need?" "We got a donation yesterday. Piano. It's still in the loading area. I need help getting it into the hall." Tyrone followed her to the back of the building. There, covered in a dusty tarp, sat an old upright piano. It was clearly vintage, the kind of instrument that had stories to tell. "Where'd it come from?" Tyrone asked, as he helped Margaret remove the tarp. "Estate sale. Woman passed away and her kids didn't want it. Thought it might be nice for the after-school program." As the tarp came away, Tyrone froze. The piano was beautiful in an old-fashioned way. Dark wood, slightly faded, but still elegant. But it wasn't the overall appearance that stopped Tyrone cold. It was the details. The ornate carvings along the sides, the specific pattern of mother-of-pearl inlays along the music stand, the particular shade of the wood grain. He'd seen this piano before. He was certain of it. "You okay, Tyrone?" Margaret's voice seemed to come from far away. "Yeah, He stepped closer, his hand reaching out almost involuntarily to touch the keys. "Can I?" "Of course." His fingers settled on the keys. He hadn't played piano in years, not since he was a child, but somehow his hands remembered. They found a simple melody, something from deep in his memory, something his grandmother used to play. The sound that came from the old piano was imperfect, but beautiful. Some keys stuck slightly. Others were out of tune, but the voice of the instrument was warm and full of character. And with that sound came a flood of memories. His grandmother's small apartment, the smell of her cooking, the way she'd sit at her piano, a piano that looked exactly like this one, and play for hours, the way she'd pull young Tyrone onto her lap and guide his small hands across the keys, teaching him simple melodies. "You've got music in your blood, baby," she'd tell him. "Don't ever forget that." But he had forgotten. Or rather, life had gotten in the way. His grandmother had died when he was 10. His mother, struggling with her own demons, had never mentioned the piano again. Tyrone's childhood had been chaotic, and music had seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. Now, 25 years later, he stood in front of what might be his grandmother's piano, and all those memories came rushing back. Tyrone Margaret was watching him with concern. "Are you sure you're okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He pulled his hands back from the keys. "I'm fine. Just this piano. It reminds me of my grandmother's." "Really? That's quite a coincidence." Tyrone bent down to look at the piano more closely. He ran his hands along the sides, examining the carvings. Then he lifted the keyboard cover and looked at the wood beneath. And there it was. Carved into the wood so small you'd miss it if you weren't looking, were initials LM. 1947. Tyrone's heart began to race. L.M. Loretta Mitchell, his grandmother. For the rest of that day, Tyrone couldn't focus on his work. His mind kept drifting back to the piano, to those initials, to the possibility that seemed too incredible to be real. That evening, he told Angela everything over dinner. "You think it's really hers?" Angela asked, her dark eyes reflecting the same wonder Tyrone felt. "I don't know how it could be, but those initials, the carvings, everything about it. Angie, I've never seen another piano that looked like that one. What are you going to do? I need to find out for sure. I need to know where it's been all these years." Angela reached across the table and took his hand. "Then you should find out. But baby, be careful. I don't want you getting your hopes up only to be disappointed." "I know, but I have to try." Maya, their 7-year-old, looked up from her plate. "Daddy, what was Grandma Loretta like?" Tyrone smiled sadly. "I was only 10 when she passed, sweetheart. But I remember she was kind, and she loved music more than anything." "Did she really play piano?" "She did. She was really good." That night, after the kids were asleep, Tyrone sat at their small kitchen table with an old shoebox. Inside were the few things he had from his grandmother. A handful of photographs, a recipe card in her handwriting, a pair of her reading glasses. He spread the photographs out on the table. Most were snapshots. His grandmother at family gatherings, his grandmother holding baby Tyrone, his grandmother in church. But one photo was different. It was older, more formal. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, sitting at a piano. She was dressed elegantly, her hair styled in the fashion of the 1940s. And though the photo was black and white and slightly faded, there was no mistaking the joy on her face. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written Loretta Riverside Jazz Club, 1948. Tyrone turned the photo over and over in his hands. His grandmother had played at a jazz club. She'd never mentioned anything like that. Neither had his mother. In fact, his mother rarely talked about her own mother at all. The next morning, Tyrone arrived at work an hour early. Before starting his usual routine, he went to the main hall where the piano now sat. In the daylight streaming through the tall windows, he examined it more carefully. The instrument was old, but had been well maintained at some point. Someone had cared for this piano. The wood was scratched and faded in places, but the underlying craftsmanship was evident. This had been an expensive instrument in its day. He sat down on the bench and began to play. The melody came back to him slowly at first, then with more confidence. It was a song his grandmother had taught him, something slow and melancholy, full of complex emotions he'd been too young to understand. As his fingers moved across the keys, more memories surfaced. His grandmother humming as she cooked, the way she'd close her eyes when she played, the strange sadness that sometimes crossed her face when she thought no one was watching. That's beautiful. Tyrone looked up to find Margaret standing nearby, holding her morning coffee. Sorry, Miss Margaret. I didn't mean to. Don't apologize. You play well. Where did you learn? My grandmother taught me when I was little. Margaret came closer, listening as Tyrone continued to play. She must have been a good teacher. That's not simple music. Tyrone stopped playing and looked up at her. Miss Margaret, do you know anything about where this piano came from? I mean, specifically. You said it was from an estate sale. Let me check the paperwork. Margaret disappeared into her office and returned a few minutes later with a folder. The donation came through Henderson Estate Sales. It was part of the estate of a... She squinted at the document, Florence Henderson. Does that name mean anything to you? Tyrone shook his head. No, ma'am. The address was on the north side. The family wanted to clear out the house quickly. According to this, the piano had been in storage for years. She handed him a business card. You could try calling them. They might have more information. Tyrone took the card. Thank you, Miss Margaret. Of course. And Tyrone, if this piano does turn out to be your grandmother's, I think it should be yours. We can find another one for the center. That afternoon, during his lunch break, Tyrone called the number on the card. A woman answered on the third ring. Henderson Estate Sales. This is Diane. Hi, my name is Tyrone Washington. You handled an estate recently, a Florence Henderson on the north side. There was a piano. Oh yes, the Henderson estate. What about it? The piano was donated to the community center where I work. I think it might have belonged to my grandmother. I was wondering if you could tell me anything about how Mrs. Henderson got it. There was a pause. I'm sorry I don't have that kind of detailed provenance on most items. Mrs. Henderson was elderly when she passed, 93. The piano had been in her basement for as long as her children could remember. Do you know where she might have gotten it? I'm afraid not. But another pause. You know, one of her sons mentioned something about his mother buying a lot of things at estate sales herself back in the 50s and 60s. She apparently loved antiques. It's possible she purchased the piano from another estate. Tyrone felt his excitement dim slightly. The trail was already getting cold. Is there anyone I could talk to? Anyone who might know more? The family has already moved out of state. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful. But if the piano is important to you, I'm glad it went somewhere. It'll be appreciated. After hanging up, Tyrone sat in the break room staring at the card. The piano had been in storage since at least the 1950s or 1960s, that timeline fit at. His grandmother had passed away in 1999, but what had happened to her piano after she died? His mother had been in no state to take care of it. Maybe it had been sold. Maybe it had passed through several hands before ending up in Florence Henderson's basement. But how could he know for sure? That night, Angela made a suggestion. The library has those old newspaper archives on microfiche. If your grandmother really did play at a jazz club, maybe there's something about her in old papers. It was a long shot, but it was something. The next morning, Tyrone asked Margaret if he could take a long lunch break. She agreed without hesitation, seeing the determination in his eyes. The Milwaukee Public Library was only a few blocks from the community center. Tyrone had been there countless times, usually checking out books for his kids. But he'd never ventured into the research section on the third floor. A librarian, a patient woman named Mrs. Chen, helped him navigate the microfiche system. What dates are you looking for? Late 1940s, maybe early 1950s. I'm looking for anything about a woman named Loretta Mitchell. She might have been a piano player. Mrs. Chen helped him load the first spool of microfiche. Jazz was huge in Milwaukee back then. Lots of clubs on the north side. If she was any good, there might be reviews or listings. Tyrone spent the next 2 hours scrolling through old newspapers, his eyes straining at the tiny print. He found listings for dozens of jazz clubs, most of which no longer existed. The Riverside Club, the Blue Moon Lounge, the Velvet Note, names from another era. And then, in a copy of the Milwaukee Journal from May 1948, he found it. A small advertisement for the Riverside Jazz Club, this Friday and Saturday. The incomparable Loretta Mitchell on piano, with the Eddie Porter Quartet. Tyrone's hands trembled as he printed the page. The incomparable Loretta Mitchell, his grandmother. He kept searching, finding more listings. His grandmother had played regularly at the Riverside from 1946 to 1951. Sometimes she was the featured act. Other times she was part of larger ensembles. Then he found a review dated June 1947. Miss Mitchell's piano work displays a technical proficiency rare in one so young, combined with an emotional depth that suggests she's lived far more than her 22 years. Her interpretation of Autumn Leaves brought several members of the audience to tears. This young woman has a brilliant future ahead of her. 22 years old. Brilliant future, technical proficiency, emotional depth. Who was his grandmother? Who had Loretta Mitchell been before she became the quiet, gentle woman who raised his mother and helped raise him? Tyrone returned to the library the next day and the day after that. Each visit revealed more pieces of the puzzle. By 1949, Loretta Mitchell was apparently one of the most sought-after jazz pianists in Milwaukee. She'd performed with visiting legends, names Tyrone recognized from his grandmother's old record collection. She'd been offered opportunities to tour, to record. But then in the spring of 1952, the mentions stopped. The last listing he could find was from March 1952. The Riverside Jazz Club proudly presents Loretta Mitchell's farewell performance. Farewell. Why Tyrone searched for months after that date, but found nothing. It was as if Loretta Mitchell had simply vanished from the music scene. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. What had happened? Why would a rising star at the height of her career simply walk away? Any luck? Mrs. Chen appeared at his shoulder, holding a fresh spool of microfiche. I found a lot about her career, but then she just disappeared. In 1952. Mrs. Chen looked thoughtful. You know, for a black female musician in that era, there could be a lot of reasons why a career suddenly ended. The music industry was incredibly difficult for women, especially women of color. And that was the early 50s, a very conservative time. Tyrone hadn't thought about it that way. He'd been so focused on the mystery of his grandmother's disappearance from the jazz scene that he hadn't considered the broader context. Is there anywhere else I could look? Any other records? Have you tried the jazz archives at the university? They have a whole collection dedicated to Milwaukee's jazz history. Photographs, interviews, that sort of thing. The next Saturday, with Angela's encouragement, Tyrone took a bus across town to the university. The jazz archives were housed in the basement of the music building, a treasure trove of Milwaukee's musical past. A graduate student named Kevin helped him navigate the collection. Loretta Mitchell. Yeah, I've come across that name. She was supposed to be really talented. Hold on. Kevin disappeared into the stacks and returned with a large box. This is all the material we have on the Riverside Jazz Club. She performed there a lot, so there might be something. Inside the box were photographs, programs, even some old 78 RPM records. Tyrone handled everything carefully, almost reverently. And then he found it. A photograph, 8 by 10 inches professionally shot. A group of musicians on stage. And there at the piano, illuminated by stage lights, was his grandmother. She was beautiful. Young, vibrant, full of life and confidence. Her hands were frozen mid-motion on the keys, and the expression on her face was pure joy. Tyrone had never seen his grandmother look like that. The woman he'd known had been gentle, yes, and loving, but there'd always been a sadness about her, a sense that she was carrying something heavy. The woman in this photograph looked free. "That's her," Tyrone whispered. "That's my grandmother." Kevin came to look over his shoulder. "Wow, she looks incredible. You can see the passion in her face." Tyrone carefully turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same handwriting from the photo he had at home, was written "Loretta and the Boys, Riverside, April 1951. April 1951. Less than a year before her final performance. "Can I make a copy of this?" Tyrone asked. "Sure, we can scan it for you." While Kevin was at the scanner, Tyrone continued looking through the box. He found programs listing his grandmother's name. More photographs including several of her playing solo. A newspaper clipping about a benefit concert where she'd performed. And then at the bottom of the box, he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a small article from the Milwaukee Sentinel, dated August 1952. The headline read, "Former jazz singer arrested in connection with Riverside Club raid." Tyrone's hands shook as he read the article. The Riverside Jazz Club had been raided by police in July 1952. Several musicians and patrons had been arrested on various charges, some legitimate, many trumped up as part of the crackdown on black-owned businesses that characterized that era. Buried in the middle of the article was a single line. Also arrested was Loretta Mitchell, 27 pianist who has since given birth to a daughter while in custody. Tyrone read the line 3 times, trying to process what it meant. His grandmother had been arrested, while pregnant with his mother. He pulled out his phone and did the math. His mother had been born in September 1952. This article was from August. The timeline fit. But why had his grandmother been at the club if she'd already performed her farewell concert months earlier? Kevin returned with the scanned photograph. "Find anything else interesting?" Tyrone showed him the article. "My grandmother was arrested." Kevin's face fell. "Man, I'm sorry. That was a really dark time. The police raided black jazz clubs constantly, usually on flimsy pretenses. It was about controlling and intimidating the black community. The article says she had a baby while in custody. That would be your mom, right? Yeah." Kevin sat down across from Tyrone. "Look, I'm not an expert on this specific case, but I've studied this era a lot. Many black musicians got caught up in these raids. Some never performed publicly again, either because they were too afraid or because they'd been essentially blacklisted. The psychological impact was intense." Tyrone stared at the article, his mind reeling. Was this why his grandmother had disappeared from the music scene? Not by choice, but because she'd been forced out. "Is there any way to find out what happened to her after this?" Tyrone asked. "Court records, maybe the university law library might have access to old county records. Or you could try the county courthouse directly." Tyrone thanked Kevin and left the archives with copies of everything he'd found. On the bus ride home, he stared at the photograph of his grandmother at the piano, so young and full of life. What had happened to her? What had those 5 months between her farewell performance and her arrest been like? And how had a talented, promising musician ended up as the quiet, almost invisible woman he'd known as a child? That night, he spread everything out on the kitchen table, all the photographs, articles, and documents he'd collected. Angela sat with him, helping him organize it into a timeline. 1946 to 1951. She's performing regularly, getting great reviews, Angela summarized. March 1952, farewell performance. July 1952, club raid and arrest. September 1952, your mom is born. And then, nothing. She just disappears from public record. Until she shows up in my childhood memories. 25 years later, Tyrone added, working as a seamstress, living alone in that tiny apartment, playing piano only for me. And she never talked about any of this, never mentioned being a professional musician. Never. My mom never mentioned it either. It's like this whole part of her life just got erased. Maya wandered into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. Daddy, why are you up so late? Tyrone pulled his daughter onto his lap. Just learning about your great-grandma sweetheart. Was she famous? She should have been. After putting Maya back to bed, Tyrone sat alone at the table staring at his grandmother's photograph. He felt angry on her behalf. Angry at whatever circumstances had stolen her career. Angry at the injustice of the raid. Angry at the silence that had buried her story. But he also felt something else, a determination to understand, to piece together what had happened and why. I need to find someone who knew her, he told Angela. Someone who was there. Someone who can tell me what really happened. The Riverside Club. Is it still around? Tyrone had looked it up. No, it closed in the 60s, but the building is still there. Maybe someone in the neighborhood remembers. The next day was Sunday, Tyrone's day off. He left early in the morning and took 2 buses to the North Side neighborhood where the Riverside had been. The building was still standing, though it had been converted to other uses over the years. Currently, it housed a barber shop on the ground floor and apartments above. The ornate facade that had once announced the club's entrance was covered by newer construction, but if you looked carefully, you could still see traces of the original architecture. Tyrone stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the building, trying to imagine his grandmother walking through those doors 70 years ago. Can I help you with something? An elderly man had emerged from the barber shop. He was probably in his 80s, walking with a cane. Sorry, Tyrone said. This building used to be a jazz club right the Riverside. Best club in Milwaukee back in the day. The old man's eyes lit up with memory. You a jazz fan? My grandmother used to play here. Loretta Mitchell. The old man's eyebrows shot up. Loretta Mitchell. You're Loretta's grandson. Tyrone felt his heart skip a beat. You knew her son. I played trumpet with Loretta for 3 years. Name's Harold Porter. Eddie Porter was my older brother. He led the quartet your grandmother played with. Tyrone couldn't believe his luck. Mr. Porter, would you have time to talk? I'm trying to learn about my grandmother's life. She never talked about it. Harold studied Tyrone's face for a long moment, then nodded. Come on, let me buy you a cup of coffee. They sat in a small diner 2 blocks from the old Riverside building. Harold moved slowly, but with dignity, his hands showing the arthritis that had probably ended his own playing career decades ago. Loretta Mitchell, Harold said, shaking his head with a mixture of fondness and sadness. I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in years. Most folks who knew her are gone now. What was she like? Tyrone asked. As a musician, I mean. Harold's face transformed, years falling away as he remembered. She was extraordinary. Not just technically good, though she was that too. She could play anything you put in front of her. But it was more than that. She felt the music. When Loretta played, you felt like she was telling you secrets, letting you see into her soul. I found old reviews that said similar things. Those reviews didn't do her justice. Loretta was going places, real places. We all knew it. She'd been talking with some folks from New York record producers. There was talk of her going to Chicago, maybe eventually Los Angeles. She could have been as big as Mary Lou Williams or Hazel Scott. So what happened? Tyrone asked. Why did she stop? Harold was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. It's not my story to tell, really. But I suppose she's gone now and you're her family. You deserve to know. He took a deep breath. Your grandmother got pregnant in late 1951. With your mother. The father was a man who came through town with a touring band. He was gone before Loretta even knew she was pregnant. Tyrone had suspected something like this from the timeline, but hearing it confirmed still hurt. Back then, Harold continued that kind of situation could ruin a woman, especially a black woman trying to make it in music. The clubs didn't want pregnant ladies on stage. The record companies didn't want to invest in someone who'd need to take time off for a baby. And society wasn't kind. The newspaper said there was a raid, that she was arrested. Harold's jaw tightened. That raid. I was there that night. The police had been harassing the Riverside for months. Parking violations, noise complaints, safety inspections. All pretense. They wanted to shut us down because we were successful, because we were black, because they could. What was my grandmother doing there if she'd already performed her farewell? She'd come to hear us play one last time. She was about 8 months pregnant, hadn't performed in months. But music was her life, you know. She couldn't stay away. Harold's voice grew thick with emotion. When the police raided, they arrested everyone. Didn't matter if you were performing or just listening. Didn't matter if you were pregnant. They took her in with everyone else. Threw her in a cell. Tyrone felt sick. The article said she gave birth in custody. 2 days later, in the county jail. They wouldn't take her to a hospital even though she was having contractions. Finally, someone with a conscience called an ambulance, but your mother was born right there in that place. Can you imagine bringing a baby into the world surrounded by concrete and bars? Tyrone couldn't speak. He thought of his mother who'd struggled with addiction and depression her whole life, who'd died 5 years ago, never having found peace. Had that trauma been passed down to her from the very moment of her birth? What happened after he managed to ask? Charges were dropped eventually. There was nothing to charge anyone with. But the damage was done. The Riverside never recovered. We tried to keep it going, but the constant harassment wore us down. The club closed within a year, and my grandmother Harold looked down at his hands. Loretta had a baby to take care of. No partner, no support system except us musicians, and we were all struggling. The New York deal fell through. They said she was unreliable because of the arrest. Chicago didn't want to take a chance on her. Her whole career, everything she'd worked for, just evaporated. But she still had her piano, Tyrone said. I have a photo of her with it from when I was little. She did keep that piano for a long time, held on to it like it was the last piece of her old life. But then, Harold paused. Your mother got sick. I'm not sure what it was. Pneumonia maybe, or something worse. They didn't have insurance. The hospital bills. She sold the piano, Tyrone whispered. Harold nodded. To pay for your mother's treatment. She sold the piano and took whatever jobs she could find. Cleaning houses, doing seamstress work, anything. She never played professionally again. Never even talked about those years as far as I know. Why didn't she fight back? Why didn't she try to reclaim her career? Son, you have to understand what it was like. A black woman with a baby, no husband, and arrest record. Even though the charges were dropped, she was fighting just to survive. And beyond that, Harold's voice dropped. I think it broke something in her. The raid, the birth, losing everything she'd worked for. She was never the same after that. The fire went out. They sat in silence for a long moment. Around them, the diner buzzed with ordinary Sunday morning activity people living their normal lives, unaware of the story being told at the corner booth. "She taught me to play Tyrone," finally said. "When I was little. I didn't know what it meant then, but she'd put me on her lap and guide my hands on the keys." Harold smiled. She was passing it on. "That's what we do, those of us who love music. We pass it on even when the world tries to take it from us. I found her piano, the one she sold. It ended up at the community center where I work." Harold's eyes widened. "You found it. After all these years, it still has her initials carved under the keyboard. LM 1947. Lord have mercy." Harold shook his head in wonder. That piano. Loretta loved that instrument. She used to say it was the only thing that really understood her. And now it's found its way back to her family. It feels like, I don't know, like fate or something. Maybe it is. Maybe Loretta's still trying to tell you something." Harold reached across the table and gripped Tyrone's hand with surprising strength. "Your grandmother was denied the recognition she deserved. Her story was buried, her talent forgotten. But you know now. You can make sure people remember. How? What can I do? Play her piano. Tell her story. Don't let what happened to her be the end. Let it be a beginning." Tyrone spent another hour with Harold listening to stories about his grandmother. Harold showed him pictures on his phone, photographs he'd had scanned from his own collection. Loretta on stage, Loretta laughing with other musicians, Loretta at the height of her powers commanding a keyboard like it was an extension of her soul. By the time Tyrone left the diner, he felt like he'd been through a war. The weight of his grandmother's story, the injustice of what had happened to her, the tragedy of talents wasted and dreams destroyed. It was almost too much to bear. But underneath the grief and anger, there was something else, a sense of purpose. Harold's words echoed in his mind. Don't let what happened to her be the end. Let it be a beginning. That night, Tyrone sat at the kitchen table with Angela, telling her everything Harold had shared. Angela listened with tears streaming down her face. "That's so unfair," she said when he finished. "Your grandmother deserved better. Your mother deserved better. You deserve to have known this part of your family's story." "I keep thinking about all the years she lived with this," Tyrone said. "Carrying this pain, this loss, and never talking about it, never complaining. Maybe she was trying to protect you, protect your mother. Sometimes people think if they don't talk about trauma, it'll hurt less. But it doesn't work that way, does it? My mom struggled her whole life. Maybe if she'd known where that pain came from, understood her mother's story." They sat in silence, both thinking about Tyrone's mother who'd battled addiction and depression, until it finally killed her 5 years ago. She'd been 47, the same age Loretta had been when Tyrone was born. "I feel guilty," Tyrone admitted. "Like I should have asked more questions when Grandma Loretta was alive. I should have known there was more to her story. You were a child. How could you have known? But even as an adult before she died, I could have asked. I could have stopped." Angela took his hands in hers. "You can't carry guilt for not knowing what no one told you. Your grandmother chose to keep this private. That was her right. What matters now is what you do with the knowledge you have. Harold said I should play her piano, tell her story. Do you want to?" Tyrone thought about it. The idea terrified him. He hadn't played piano seriously in 25 years. He worked as a custodian. Who was he to honor his grandmother's legacy? But at the same time, who better? He was her grandson. He had her music in his blood. And he had her piano. "I want to," he said. "But I don't know if I can. I'm not good enough. Maybe you're better than you think. And even if you're not, what matters is the trying right. Honoring her memory by doing what she loved to do." Over the next few days, Tyrone found himself thinking constantly about Harold's words. Every time he went to work, and saw the piano sitting in the community center's main hall, he felt both drawn to it and afraid of it. Finally, one evening after everyone else had gone home, he sat down at the piano and really played for the first time since he was a child. His fingers were stiff at first, uncertain. The melodies didn't come easily. But as he worked through scales and simple pieces, muscle memory began to return. His grandmother's teaching, buried deep in his brain, started to resurface. He played for an hour, then 2, lost in the music, lost in memories of his grandmother's patient voice guiding him. No baby like this. Feel the rhythm. Let the music tell you what to do. When he finally stopped his fingers aching, he found Margaret standing in the doorway. "How long have you been there?" he asked, embarrassed. "Long enough to hear that you have real talent, Tyrone. That wasn't a custodian playing. That was a musician. My grandmother was the musician. I'm just remembering what she taught me." Margaret came into the room and sat in one of the chairs near the piano. "I think you should play for people. Perform." "What? No, I'm not. I couldn't." "Why not?" "This is a community center. We host events all the time. We could organize a concert. It would be perfect." The idea both thrilled and terrified Tyrone. "I'd need to practice, a lot. And I'd need help. I'm not good enough to do a whole concert alone. So practice and find help. What about that man you mentioned, Harold? Would he play with you?" Tyrone thought about it. Would Harold? He was elderly, probably hadn't performed in years. But there'd been something in the old man's eyes when he'd talked about the Riverside days. A longing, a piece of himself that had been set aside but never forgotten. "I could ask?" Tyrone said slowly. "Then ask." "Tyrone, this is about more than just a concert. It's about honoring your grandmother's legacy. It's about telling a story that deserves to be told. And honestly, I think you need this. I've worked with you for 7 years and I've never seen you as alive as you look when you're sitting at that piano." That night, Tyrone called Harold. The old man answered on the 4th ring, sounding wary. "Mr. Porter, it's Tyrone Washington. We met last week. Loretta's grandson." "Of course I remember. I have a question for you, and you can say no. I'd understand if you did." "Go ahead. The community center where I work wants to host a concert. Piano and trumpet. The music my grandmother played. Would you consider playing with me to honor her memory?" There was a long silence. Tyrone was about to apologize for asking when he heard a sound on the other end of the line. Harold was crying. "I haven't played in 10 years. Harold finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "My hands don't work like they used to. Neither do mine. I haven't really played in 25 years. We'd be 2 amateurs struggling through, but we'd be doing it for her, for Grandma Loretta." Another long pause. Then, "When's the concert?" "We haven't set a date yet. Whenever you'd be ready. Give me 2 months. I need to get my trumpet out of storage and see if I can still make it sing." And Tyrone. "Yes, sir. Thank you for asking. Your grandmother would be proud." After hanging up, Tyrone sat at the kitchen table, feeling overwhelmed. He'd committed to something huge. A public performance. Honoring his grandmother's memory in front of his entire community. Angela came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "You're doing the right thing. What if I fail? What if I can't do her justice? Then you'll have tried. That's what matters. Your grandmother didn't get to have her moment, didn't get the recognition she deserved, but you're going to make sure people know her name, know her story. That's not failure, baby. That's love." The next 2 months were a blur of activity. Tyrone practiced every day, before work, during lunch breaks, after his shift ended. His fingers, rough from years of manual labor, slowly remembered their old patterns. The calluses he'd developed from mopping floors were joined by new calluses from piano keys. Harold came to the community center twice a week. The old man moved slowly, his fingers stiff with arthritis, but when he lifted his trumpet to his lips, something magical happened. The years fell away. The pain in his joints seemed to fade, and the music that came out was still beautiful, still full of soul. They worked through the standards that Loretta had loved. Autumn Leaves, Round Midnight, Take the A Train. Songs from an era that felt impossibly distant, but somehow still immediate, still relevant. Margaret spread word about the concert. What had started as a simple idea grew into something larger. Local news picked up the story. Custodian honors grandmother's forgotten legacy. The community center's social media posts about the event were shared hundreds of times. Tyrone found himself both excited and terrified by the attention. He was just a custodian trying to honor his grandmother. He wasn't looking to be a celebrity. But Angela reminded him, "This isn't about you. It's about her. Let people know her story." As the concert date approached, a Friday evening in late November, Tyrone felt increasingly nervous. What if he forgot the music? What if his hands froze up? What if he dishonored his grandmother's memory instead of honoring it? "You're going to be fine," Harold told him at their final rehearsal the day before the concert. "You know why? Because you're not trying to be your grandmother. You're trying to tell her story. That's different. That's authentic." The night of the concert, Tyrone arrived at the community center 2 hours early. The main hall had been set up with rows of chairs. The piano had been tuned professionally donated by a local music store after they heard about the event. Stage lights had been set up. It looked more professional than anything Tyrone had imagined. "How are you feeling?" Margaret asked, finding him standing alone in the hall, staring at the piano. "Terrified." "Good. That means it matters." People started arriving an hour before the scheduled start time. Tyrone watched from backstage as the seats filled up. His wife and kids sat in the front row. Community members he'd known for years. People he'd never met who'd heard about the event and wanted to come. By the time 7 o'clock arrived, every seat was full, and people were standing along the walls. Harold found Tyrone backstage. The old man was dressed in a sharp suit, his trumpet case in hand. "You ready? No?" "Good. Neither am I. Let's do this anyway." Margaret stepped onto the small stage to introduce them. Tyrone heard her voice explaining the story. His grandmother, the Riverside Club, the injustice that had ended her career, the piano that had found its way back. Then she called them out. Tyrone walked onto the stage with legs that felt like rubber. The audience applauded. He sat at the piano bench, his grandmother's piano, and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment, he couldn't move. The fear was overwhelming. Then he looked out and saw Angela in the front row, tears already streaming down her face. Saw his daughter Maya, 7 years old, watching with wide eyes. Saw all these people who'd come to hear Loretta Mitchell's story. And he felt his grandmother's hands on his the way she'd placed them when he was small. Heard her voice. "You've got music in your blood, baby." He began to play. The first notes were tentative, uncertain, but as the melody developed, his confidence grew. This was Autumn Leaves, the song that had made audiences cry when his grandmother played it. He poured everything into it. His love for her, his grief at what had been taken from her, his anger at the injustice, his hope that her story would be remembered. Harold joined in with the trumpet, the two instruments weaving together like old friends reuniting. The sound was imperfect. Tyrone's fingers stumbled here and there. Harold's breath control wasn't what it had been. But the emotion was perfect. When the song ended, the audience applauded, but Tyrone barely heard it. He was lost in the music, in the connection to his grandmother. Before starting the next song, he spoke into the microphone Margaret had set up. My grandmother, Loretta Mitchell, was one of the most talented jazz pianists in Milwaukee in the 1940s and early 1950s. She played with legends. She was on her way to national recognition. But her career was stolen from her by injustice, by a system that saw her as less than human because of the color of her skin. She was arrested while pregnant, gave birth in a jail cell, and lost everything she'd worked for. His voice cracked with emotion, but he continued. She never complained, never spoke about what had been taken from her. She just survived, did what she had to do to take care of her daughter, and eventually to help raise me. Before she died, she taught me to play piano on this instrument, the same piano she'd once used to create beauty and hope in a world that tried to crush her. He placed his hands back on the keys. This concert is for her, for Loretta Mitchell, for the music she wasn't allowed to share, for the legacy she deserves to have. The audience was completely silent. Tyrone played again, and this time there was no fear. He played as if his grandmother was sitting beside him, as if her hands were guiding his, as if all the years of silence could be undone by this one evening of music. They performed for 90 minutes. Tyrone played solos. Harold played solos. They played together. Between songs, Tyrone told stories about his grandmother, about the Riverside Club, about Harold and the other musicians who'd made Milwaukee's jazz scene vibrant. And through it all, the audience was rapt. Some people cried openly. Others smiled, swaying to the music. A few elderly audience members who remembered the Riverside days nodded along, transported back in time. During the final song, a slow, haunting melody his grandmother had loved, Tyrone felt something shift. It was as if the boundary between past and present had thinned. He could almost see her there, could almost feel her presence. Not sad anymore, not burdened by what had been taken from her, but free. The way she'd looked in that photograph from 1951, full of joy and life and power. When the last note faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the entire audience rose to their feet, applauding. Not polite applause, but something deeper. Recognition, respect, shared grief, and shared joy. Tyrone stood up from the piano bench, tears streaming down his face. Harold came to stand beside him, the old trumpeter's eyes also wet. They'd done it. They'd honored Loretta Mitchell's memory. They'd told her story. And for one evening at least, her music had lived again. In the days following the concert, Tyrone found himself both exhausted and energized. The event had been covered by local news. People stopped him on the street to thank him for sharing his grandmother's story. Several elderly residents came forward with their own memories of Loretta Mitchell, and the Riverside Club adding pieces to the puzzle of who she'd been. One woman, 92 years old, brought Tyrone a photograph she'd kept for decades. It showed Loretta at the piano, surrounded by young students. She taught neighborhood kids for free, the woman explained. In the years before she got arrested, before everything fell apart. She wanted to pass on what she knew. So even then, Tyrone realized, even at the height of her career, his grandmother had been teaching, passing on the gift of music. 2 weeks after the concert, Margaret called Tyrone into her office. "I have a proposal for you. Several, actually." She explained that this concert had inspired donations to the community center, enough to fund a proper music program. "We want you to run it, teach piano to neighborhood kids who couldn't otherwise afford lessons. Use your grandmother's piano." Tyrone was stunned. "But I'm a custodian. I don't have teaching credentials, or you have something more important. You have passion and a story to tell. Besides, you'd still do your custodian work too. This would be additional paid at a fair rate." What do you say Tyrone thought about his grandmother teaching neighborhood kids for free? About her hands guiding his small fingers across the keys? About legacy and inheritance and what it means to pass something on? I say yes. The music program started in January. Tyrone's first group of students were 6 kids from the neighborhood aged 7 to 12. They came twice a week, eager and nervous and full of potential. As Tyrone taught them scales and simple melodies, he found himself using his grandmother's words, her teaching methods. The circle was completing itself. What she'd given to him, he was now giving to others. His daughter Maya was one of his students, and watching her small hands on the same keys her great-grandmother had played felt like watching time fold in on itself. Harold came to some of the classes, showing the kids his trumpet telling stories about the old days. The children were fascinated by this living link to history, this man who'd known their teacher's legendary grandmother. On what would have been Loretta Mitchell's 98th birthday, Tyrone organized a small memorial at the community center. He played some of her favorite songs. Harold spoke about her talent and her character, and they unveiled a small plaque that Margaret had commissioned to be permanently mounted on the piano. This piano belonged to Loretta Mitchell, 1925 to 1999, an extraordinary jazz pianist whose career was cut short by injustice, but whose love of music lived on through her family and students. May her legacy continue to inspire. After the memorial, as people were leaving, an elderly black woman approached Tyrone. She was elegant, well-dressed, probably in her 80s. "You don't know me," she said, "but I knew your grandmother. We were friends when we were young before everything happened." "Please," Tyrone gestured to a chair. "Tell me about her." The woman sat down, smiling at memories. Loretta was fierce. That's the word I'd use. Fierce in her talent, fierce in her determination. She knew the world wasn't fair, especially not to black women. But she refused to let that stop her. She was going to make it anyway, on pure talent and will. "What happened after the raid?" Tyrone asked. "After she lost her career, she broke," the woman said simply. "Not all at once, but gradually. Losing her music was like losing part of her soul. But even then, she never became bitter. She just redirected. Put all that fierce love into raising your mother and later into you. I wish I'd known her story when she was alive. Maybe it's better that you know it now. When she was alive, it was too painful for her to talk about. Now you can tell it without hurting her. You can make sure people remember who she was at her best, not just what was done to her." The woman stood to leave, then turned back. "She would be so proud of you, Tyrone, not just for your music, but for your character. You inherited more from her than just talent. You inherited her heart." That night, after everyone had gone home, Tyrone sat alone at his grandmother's piano. He played quietly, not performing, just communing with the instrument and with her memory. He thought about the journey this piano had been on. Bought by a young Loretta Mitchell in 1947, laid in jazz clubs and small apartments, sold to pay hospital bills, lost for decades, stored in basements, and finally finding its way back to her family. Objects have no memory, no consciousness. But this piano felt alive to Tyrone, felt like it carried his grandmother's spirit somehow. His phone buzzed. A text from Angela. "Don't stay too late. You have students tomorrow. Maya is already asking when she gets to play again." Tyrone smiled. Maya, the 4th generation, learning music from her father, who'd learned from his grandmother, who'd learned from teachers, now long forgotten. The chain of music unbroken despite everything. As Tyrone locked up the community center and headed home through the cold November night, he thought about legacy. Not the kind that makes you famous or rich, but the kind that lives in the people who come after you. In the songs they play, the stories they tell, the love they pass on. His grandmother hadn't gotten the career she deserved. History had tried to erase her. But she hadn't been erased. Not really. She lived on in every note Tyrone played, in every student he taught, in every person who heard her story and remembered her name. Loretta Mitchell, pianist, teacher, survivor, grandmother. Her music interrupted, but never truly silenced, was playing again. And it would continue to play, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, as long as there were people who remembered that talent and love could outlast injustice. As long as there was someone willing to sit at an old piano and say, "This belonged to someone remarkable." Let me tell you her story.